All right, so this is where we left off with period 3. Remember, if this is period 6, you're able to skip ahead to the next question, which is question 7. So period 3, we were talking about why did nationalism spread to the other parts of the Middle East. And we were talking about the whole issue of the creation of the World Zionist Organization, which was in 1897, the issuing of the letter in 1915 to Ali ibn Hussein, who was the Sharif of Mecca, and then in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, which promised Zionists a Jewish homeland. When the Balfour Declaration was issued and the Jewish Zionist Organization was promised a Jewish homeland, we start to see many Jews emigrating from Europe into the region. And for the Arabs, they were very upset that they saw this increased Jewish immigration, and they were upset because they were realizing that the British had promised land that they felt was theirs was being promised to the Jews. Then, to add insult to injury, in 1922, the League of Nations created the Mandate of Palestine and gave that to Britain. So the Arabs didn't get the land that they were promised. The British took it for themselves, and that land was also promised to the Jews. So with that Jewish immigration that was beginning to enter into the area, the Arabs began to protest, and actually the British government makes the decision to close the borders of Palestine to further Jewish immigration. And that is going to create some issues later, especially during the Holocaust, because then Jews were not allowed to immigrate to the Holy Land to flee the Nazis during the Holocaust. But the Arabs saw this all as a double betrayal, and they began to distrust the British and kind of begin to launch a resistance. The issue, though, with the Palestinian resistance was that there was no strong Palestinian leadership like there was amongst the Zionists, which was a very well-organized organization. And if we see here, this is actually an image of the Balfour Declaration, and it says here, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. And so we could see this was what upset the Arabs, because they had been promised the same land. So now we're going to be moving out of the Middle East. And actually, I should say before I go on, you read for homework the other night the Syrian Congress Memorandum. And the Syrian Congress Memorandum is written in response to the creation of a British mandate and a response to the Balfour Declaration being issued. And it was the Syrians basically protest against these developments that were occurring within their area. So we're going to now move on to this last question, question number 7, which is, why did independence movements begin in Africa? So again, Africa does not get its independence. All the various different African nations are not going to achieve independence until much later, until after World War II, and even then it's not going to be until the 50s, 60s, and then even as late as the 70s when we see the African nations gaining independence from their various different colonial mother countries. But the group that is going to be leading these nations towards the path of independence are going to be similar to the people that led India towards that path, and similar to the people that led Egypt towards that path, and that is going to be your Western educated upper class. And like the INC in India, these people in Africa were originally loyal to their colonizers. They were loyal to them during World War I. They supported the war effort, but they were promised things like better jobs and equal treatment, and these promises were not kept by the British and the French. A lot of local rebellions broke out across Africa because many people were being forcefully recruited as soldiers or laborers to aid in the war effort. And like we see in places like India and in Egypt, the villagers were going hungry because crops were being requisitioned for the war effort. So in the 1920s, there was a movement that developed to try to build up some organizations that would be promoting African culture and promoting African independence in general. These were referred to as the Pan-African Movement. And so basically this means all Africans, so the desire to bring all Africans together. The leadership of these movements were African American and also West Indian. And the movement really wasn't that successful because when you think about it, the challenges that colonized African nations have are much different than the challenges that an African American faces. But it created support for the independence movements, and it created a sense of African unity, and it helped to kind of glorify and celebrate the culture of the various different African nations, because you remember the British, when they kind of said that they were justified in taking over these areas, one of the justifications that they used was the fact that Africa had no culture and they didn't have any civilization, and so the Pan-African movements tried to combat that. Another movement called the Negritude Movement was also centered around that ends. It was a literary movement, and they wanted to combat racial stereotyping, figured that if they promoted African writers and African art and African culture, this could combat that racial stereotyping that they had no culture. Now, in France, educated African groups were represented in the French parliaments. And in Britain, we do start to see some Western educated Africans given opportunities to build political organizations. So in the British colonies, we have what's called the National Congress of British West Africa. That's Africa. And this was pushing for representation in colonial advisory councils, and this is also going to be the group that's going to begin to really start to make attacks on British rule and try to push these areas towards independence. But again, this doesn't happen until 50s, 60s, and 70s. So the question I want you to think about in talking about all these areas, India, the Middle East, and Africa, why did the colonial holdings of Europe begin to move towards independence? So I want you to think about that question. I'll see you guys in class tomorrow, and we're going to be talking about the Russian Revolution.